Rain traced slow lines down the tall windows of Ashcombe Hall, blurring the world outside into gray smudges of what had once been glory. Inside, the great hall smelled of damp stone and old wax. The chandeliers above dimmed to half their candles because full light was a luxury the estate could no longer afford. Dust settled quietly on portraits of ancestors who had never known ruin. In the far corner, beneath a window no one bothered to look through anymore, a woman knelt beside a cracked ledger and a basket of mending. Her fingers, chapped from cold and work, moved with quiet precision, stitching a torn hem, then pausing to glance at numbers scratched into the ledger's margin, numbers that did not belong to any servant's duties. No one noticed. No one ever did. She had learned, over the years, how to become part of the furniture, how to blend into shadows the way the old tapestries did, faded and forgotten but still holding the walls together. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy, deliberate, indifferent. The Duke passed through the hall without a glance in her direction, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the room, beyond the crumbling estate itself. He did not see her. He never did. To him, she was simply part of the house's quiet machinery, necessary, invisible, unremarkable. She lowered her head as he passed, not from fear but from habit. 3 years of silence had taught her exactly how much space she was allowed to take. But as the door closed behind him, her eyes flicked back to the ledger. Her fingers traced a column of numbers only she seemed to understand, numbers that told a story far different from the one everyone believed. Something flickered behind her calm expression, not sadness this time but calculation. She knew something. Something no one else in that house had even begun to suspect. 3 years ago, she had arrived at Ashcombe Hall with nothing but a single trunk and a letter of introduction that no one had bothered to read twice. A distant cousin by marriage, the housekeeper had called her, the kind of relation families acknowledged only when convenient and forgot the moment it wasn't. The Duke had granted her a room in the East Wing, small, sparse, forgotten, and considered the matter closed. He had not asked her name more than once. He had not asked why a woman of her evident education found herself mending linens and balancing household accounts instead of sitting at dinner tables. He had simply absorbed her into the machinery of the house the way one absorbs a piece of furniture, useful and unremarkable, and moved on with the weight of his own collapsing world. Her days began before the sun rose and ended long after the last candle guttered out. She managed accounts the steward was too proud to admit he couldn't balance. She mended clothes the family could no longer afford to replace. She listened, always listened, to conversations that drifted past her as though she were made of glass, transparent and unimportant. And in that listening she learned things. She learned which merchants the estate owed money to, which debts were quietly growing teeth, which secrets the Duke buried beneath his silence and his pride. She catalogued it all, not from malice, but from a habit born of necessity. A woman with no power learns to survive on knowledge instead. At night, alone in her narrow room, she allowed herself exactly one indulgence. A worn leather notebook filled with figures, observations, and the quiet architecture of a plan she had not yet dared to name. She told herself it was nothing. Preparation perhaps. Or simply a way to feel less invisible in a house that had long since stopped seeing her. But some nights, staring at the numbers she had gathered, she wondered if the day might come when someone, anyone, would finally need what she knew. There had been a time when Ashcombe Hall glittered. When carriages lined the drive for weeks at a stretch, when the ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, and when the Duke's father had been spoken of in London drawing rooms with equal parts envy and admiration. Wealth had once flowed through these halls like water, endless, assumed, unquestioned. But wealth, the current Duke had learned too late, was built on foundations his father had never bothered to inspect. The debts had started quietly, a loan here, a mortgaged field there, decisions made in card rooms and back offices that no one thought to mention until the bills arrived with interest that had multiplied like something feral. By the time the old Duke died, leaving his son a title heavier than any crown, the estate was already hollowed out from within, a grand shell built over rot. The son inherited not just land and title, but silence. No one had taught him where the money had gone, only that it was gone, and that admitting as much would be its own kind of ruin. So he did what men of his standing had always done. He said nothing. He smiled at dinners he could barely afford to host. He signed papers he didn't fully understand. He let pride stand where honesty should have. Each season the collapse crept closer. Fields once tended by dozens now sat fallow, workers let go with apologies he could not afford to make sincere. The staff dwindled. The silverware disappeared, piece by piece, sold in quiet transactions in nearby towns where no one recognized the crest. And still he refused to ask for help. Not from neighbors, not from distant relations, not even from the quiet woman in the East Wing who balanced his books better than his own steward. To ask would be to admit the truth he could not face, that the empire his family had built was crumbling beneath him, and he did not know how to stop it. So he walked his halls like a ghost haunting his own house, blind to the one person who might have already begun to see a way out. Beneath the floorboard of her narrow room, wrapped in a strip of faded linen, lay something she had carried with her long before Ashcombe Hall had ever known her name. She had not looked at it in weeks, she rarely needed to. Every line of it was memorized, etched into her mind the way scripture is etched into the faithful. It was not jewelry. It was not money. It was something far more dangerous in a house teetering on the edge of ruin, knowledge, written in her late father's careful hand, knowledge he had spent a lifetime gathering and had entrusted to no one but her. She had told no one of its existence. Not the housekeeper who had welcomed her with polite indifference. Not the steward who eyed her ledgers with quiet suspicion. Certainly not the Duke, who had never asked her a single question worth answering. Some nights she unwrapped it simply to remind herself it was real, that she was not merely a woman mending hems in a dying house, but someone who held, in her hands, the kind of leverage most people never touched in a lifetime. She would trace the ink with her fingertip, feel the weight of what it meant, and then wrap it away again, unwilling, not yet, to let it see the light. Why she waited, even she could not fully explain. Perhaps it was caution. Perhaps it was the quiet, aching hope that circumstances might change on their own, that she would not have to spend the one thing that made her valuable. Or perhaps, some small part of her wanted to see just how far pride could carry a man before it broke him entirely. But lately the numbers in the estate's ledgers had grown sharper, more urgent. Letters from creditors had begun arriving with a colder tone. And she understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to read a house's suffering long before its master admitted it aloud, that the day was coming. The floorboard would not stay closed forever. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried in by a boy soaked through from the rain, his knuckles white around an envelope stamped with a seal the Duke recognized immediately, and dreaded. He took it to his study without a word, closing the door with a firmness that made the walls themselves seem to hold their breath. Inside the words were polite, formal, devastating. The bank required payment in full within 30 days or Ashcombe Hall, its lands, its title deeds, the very stones that had sheltered 5 generations, would pass into the hands of men who had never once set foot in its halls. He read it 3 times as though repetition might change the ink itself. 30 days. The number sat in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading rings of panic he refused to let show on his face. He could write to his second cousin in Kent, who had offered help once before in gentler days. He could approach the bank directly, plead for time, lay bare the truth of his situation. He could, if pride allowed it, ask the very household around him if anyone possessed the means or knowledge to help. He did none of it. Instead, he poured a glass of brandy with a hand that trembled only slightly, and told himself this was simply another obstacle, another storm to weather alone, as he always had. To admit weakness now, to anyone, would be to confirm what the whispers in London already suspected, that the great house of Ashcombe was finished, and its last duke had let it die. Down the hall, unseen, the woman paused outside his study door, a stack of linens in her arms. She had heard enough, the tremor in his voice through the wood, the particular silence that followed bad news. She did not need to read the letter to understand its weight. She continued down the corridor, her expression unreadable, her mind already turning toward the floorboard beneath her bed, and the choice she knew was coming. The steward arrived the following morning, his face gray with sleeplessness. Carrying a satchel of papers he spread across the study desk like a man laying out the pieces of a puzzle he already knew he couldn't solve. The Duke stood at the window, arms crossed, listening to explanations of interest rates and payment schedules that blurred together into a single, suffocating sound. She had been asked to bring in tea, nothing more. A servant's task, unremarkable, forgettable. But as she set the tray down, her eyes moved, quick, practiced, unnoticed, across the papers scattered before them. And in that single glance, she saw what neither man in the room had managed to see in weeks of frantic calculation. The debt itself was real, yes. But the steward had miscounted the timber revenue from the northern acres, folding it into last year's figures instead of this year's, which meant the estate's actual shortfall was smaller than the panic in the room suggested. Not small enough to erase the danger, but small enough to matter if someone knew where to look. She said nothing. She poured the tea, adjusted the cups with practiced hands, and withdrew from the room as quietly as she had entered, leaving the two men to their spiraling calculations. In the corridor, she allowed herself a breath, a flicker of something between frustration and disbelief. It would take her perhaps an hour to untangle the error properly, to lay out the true numbers in a way that might buy the estate precious time. An hour of work that could mean the difference between ruin and survival. But she thought of the Duke's cold silence, the countless times he had walked past her without so much as a nod, and she hesitated at the top of the stairs. Some truths, she had learned, were dangerous to offer freely. Especially to men too proud to believe a woman like her could see what they, with all their titles and ledgers, had missed entirely. That evening she found the courage to speak. It was a small thing really, a passing comment as she cleared the remains of his solitary dinner, her voice careful and even. She mentioned that the timber revenue from the northern acres seemed to have been counted twice in the steward's figures, that a closer look might reveal the shortfall wasn't quite as dire as it appeared. The Duke looked up at her as though she had spoken in a language he did not recognize. For a moment, something almost like curiosity crossed his face, a flicker quickly extinguished. Then his expression hardened into the same polite indifference he wore for the world. "That's kind of you," he said in the tone one might use for a child's well-meaning guess, "but these matters require a trained eye. My steward has managed these accounts for 15 years. She wanted to say that 15 years of managing something did not make a man incapable of error. She wanted to say that she had seen the numbers with her own eyes, that the mistake was there in black ink for anyone willing to look. Instead, she lowered her gaze, murmured an apology for overstepping, and gathered the last of the dishes with hands that betrayed nothing of the frustration coiling tight in her chest. He returned to his letters without another glance, already dismissing the moment from his mind. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her with more care than it deserved, as though gentleness might somehow soften the sting of being unseen yet again. In the corridor, alone, she allowed herself one long breath. 3 years of silence had taught her patience. But patience, she was beginning to understand, had a cost, and somewhere beneath the calm mask she wore so well, something had begun quietly to harden. He would learn, eventually, exactly what he had chosen to ignore. Within a week, the situation curdled into something far more dangerous than overdue payments. A second letter arrived, this one from a solicitor's office in London, its language stripped of the bank's earlier courtesy. Foreclosure proceedings would begin within a fortnight unless the debt was settled in full. Beneath the formal phrasing lay a threat sharper than any blade, the loss not just of land, but of the name that had carried Ashcombe through 5 generations. Worse still, word had begun to travel. A neighboring landowner, a man named Havers whose ambition had long outpaced his charm, arrived unannounced one afternoon under the guise of a social call. He toured the grounds with a proprietary interest that made the Duke's jaw tighten, commenting on the timber acreage, the condition of the stables, the potential of the northern fields, as though he were already sizing up a purchase rather than visiting a friend. Should things become difficult, Havers said carefully, over tea he had not been offered but poured himself, "I hope you'll think of me first. I'd hate to see Ashcombe fall into the wrong hands." The threat, wrapped in silk, was unmistakable. The Duke said nothing, but his knuckles whitened around his cup, and long after Havers departed, he remained in the drawing room, staring at the fading light through windows that had once framed a thriving world. Servants began to whisper. A scandal of this size could not stay contained within estate walls forever, Soon, London society would know that the great house of Ashcombe teetered on the edge of collapse, and pity, he understood, was so much crueler than envy had ever been. Upstairs she heard the whispers too, carried through thin walls and careless tongues. She understood, with rising urgency, that the quiet window for a solution, the option to correct the steward's error, to buy a little time, to offer help before pride demanded it be refused twice, was closing fast. 14 days. Perhaps less if Havers had his way. She sat that night with the floorboard pried open beside her, her father's careful handwriting spread across her lap, and understood that waiting any longer was no longer a choice she could afford to make. Her father had been a solicitor once, not a grand one, not the kind who dined with dukes, but a careful, meticulous man who spent 30 years untangling the financial ruins of families too proud to admit their own decline. He had taught her, from the time she was old enough to hold a pen steady, how to read a ledger the way other girls were taught to read novels, for its hidden stories, its quiet betrayals, its buried truths. Before he died, he had given her something he had spent the last years of his life compiling. A detailed record of an old maritime investment, made decades earlier by Ashcombe's own founding duke, in a shipping venture that had been presumed lost at sea and written off entirely. Presumed lost, but never legally dissolved. The shares, forgotten in the chaos of generations and inherited debts, technically still existed, tied up in a company that had quietly resurfaced and prospered years later under a different name. Her father had discovered it by accident, chasing an unrelated case, and had spent his final months verifying every detail, every document, every legal thread that connected Ashcombe Hall to a fortune no one alive remembered existed. He had told her, near the end, why he never brought it to the family himself. Pride was a poison the wealthy rarely survived being cured of, and he feared what a man like the old duke might do with unearned salvation. "Wait," he had said, pressing the papers into her hands, "until it truly matters. Until someone deserves to be saved." She had carried that weight for 3 years, waiting, watching, wondering if the moment would ever come, or if she would simply carry the secret to her own grave, unused and unspoken. But 14 days was not a margin she could afford to gamble against pride any longer. That night, she dressed in her plainest gown, gathered the papers with hands that did not shake despite her racing heart, and walked the long corridor toward the Duke's study for the second time in a week. This time, she would not wait to be dismissed. She knocked once, firmly, and entered before he could tell her to wait. The Duke looked up from his desk, startled by the unfamiliar boldness in her posture, the papers clutched against her chest like armor. "There is something you need to see," she said before he could speak, before pride could close the door on her again. "And this time I ask that you listen until I finish." Something in her voice, steady, unyielding, utterly unlike the quiet servant he had walked past for 3 years, made him set down his pen. She spread the documents across his desk, walking him through them with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the privacy of her own mind. The maritime shares. The company that had quietly absorbed the original venture. The legal thread, unbroken across decades, that still tied Ashcombe Hall to a fortune large enough to erase every debt threatening to consume it. He stared at the papers, then at her, disbelief warring with something that looked almost like fear. "This is impossible. My family's solicitors would have found this decades ago. They would have, if anyone had thought to look at a venture everyone had already agreed was lost," she said. "Your family buried this failure so deep no one thought to check if it had ever truly failed. But knowledge alone would not be enough. The shares needed to be formally reclaimed, verified through a legal process that could easily stretch beyond the 14 days they had left, unless someone moved immediately, decisively, to London itself. "I can help you file the claim," she said. "I know the language, the process, the office that must be petitioned first. But it must happen tomorrow. Today if possible." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing, torn between decades of pride and the sudden, dizzying possibility of salvation offered by the one person he had never thought to ask. Then quietly he nodded. By dawn, they were in a carriage bound for London, documents secured in a leather case she refused to let out of her sight. Every mile felt like a race against a clock neither of them could stop, Havers' shadow looming behind them, the bank's deadline tightening like a noose with each passing hour. She had waited 3 years for this moment. She would not let it slip away now. The solicitor's office in London smelled of ink and dust, its shelves lined with the quiet weight of other families' fortunes and failures. The Duke sat rigid in his chair as she spoke, not him, her, laying out the claim with a clarity and command that left the solicitor leaning forward, taking notes with growing urgency. She cited statutes he had never heard of. She corrected the solicitor's own assumptions twice, gently but firmly, each correction proving accurate under scrutiny. She produced dates, names, cross-referenced documents that connected threads across 30 years of buried history, and she did it all without once looking to the Duke for permission or approval. He watched her, and for the first time in 3 years he truly saw her. Not the quiet woman who mended linens in forgotten corners. Not the invisible presence who refilled his tea and vanished before he could form a proper thought about her existence. He saw instead a mind sharper than his own, a will steadier than his had been in months, a competence that made his carefully maintained pride feel suddenly unbearably small. Shame crept up his throat, hot and unfamiliar. How many times had he walked past her without a glance? How many evenings had he dismissed her observations as the well-meaning guesses of a woman who couldn't possibly understand matters beyond her station, only to learn now that she had understood more than his solicitors, his steward, and himself combined. When the meeting concluded, the solicitor confirming that the claim would very likely succeed within the necessary time frame, the Duke sat in stunned silence as she gathered the papers with steady hands, her expression composed, betraying nothing of the years of dismissal she had quietly endured. Outside in the carriage he finally found his voice. "Why," he asked quietly, "did you wait so long to tell me?" She met his eyes for the first time without lowering her gaze. "Because you never once asked." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. He looked away out toward the gray London streets and understood, with a clarity that cut through years of blind pride, exactly how much he had nearly lost. Not just an estate, but the chance to know the person who had saved it. The following weeks passed in a blur of legal correspondence, verified documents, and the slow, grinding machinery of London bureaucracy finally turning in their favor. The claim, once filed, moved faster than either of them had dared hope. The shipping company, eager to avoid a prolonged dispute over shares it had long assumed were abandoned, settled swiftly, releasing funds that exceeded even her father's careful estimates. The morning the payment cleared, the Duke stood in his study holding a letter from the bank. Not a demand this time, but a confirmation. The debt was settled in full. Ashcombe Hall, its lands, its title, its 5 generations of history would remain standing. He read the letter 3 times, just as he had read the foreclosure notice weeks before, but this time the words brought no dread, only a disbelief so profound it left him momentarily unable to speak. Havers' visit stopped abruptly, his carefully veiled ambitions dissolving the moment word spread that Ashcombe's debts had been cleared. The whispers in London shifted too, from pity to something closer to astonishment, though the full truth of how the estate had been saved remained, for now, known only to the 2 people who had raced against time to secure it. The creditors were paid. The solicitors filed their final confirmations. The northern fields, once threatened with seizure, remained under Ashcombe's name, and for the first time in years the house exhaled. She stood at the window of her small room in the east wing that evening, watching the last light fade over grounds that were, against every expectation, still theirs. There was no triumphant celebration, no grand announcement, only a quiet, settling relief, the kind that comes after holding one's breath for far too long. Downstairs, she could hear the Duke's footsteps, no longer heavy with the particular exhaustion of a man drowning in debt he could not name aloud. Something in the house had shifted, something beyond mere finances. She did not yet know what would come next, what place she might hold in a house that had finally learned to see her. But for the first time in 3 long years, she allowed herself to hope it might be more than the shadows she had grown so used to occupying. The Duke called a small gathering the following month. Not the lavish affairs Ashcombe had once been known for, but a modest dinner attended by the few relations and neighbors who had stood by the family through its leanest years. Havers was notably not among them. Midway through the evening, the Duke rose from his seat, and the room quieted in the particular way rooms do when a man of his standing prepares to speak. He did not deliver the vague, self-congratulatory remarks the guests had expected. Instead, he spoke plainly, his voice steady despite what the words clearly cost him. He told them the truth. That Ashcombe Hall had not been saved by his own hand, nor by the solicitors he paid handsomely, nor by any stroke of noble luck. It had been saved by a woman he had overlooked for 3 years, dismissed, unseen, undervalued, whose intelligence and quiet perseverance had accomplished what he, in his pride, had failed even to attempt. He turned to where she stood near the edge of the room as she always had, as though the years of invisibility still clung to her out of habit. "I owe this house and everyone in it to her," he said. "I should have listened the first time she spoke. I should have listened long before that." The room turned toward her, and for a moment she felt the old instinct rise, to lower her gaze, to shrink back into the comfortable shadow of unremarkable. But she resisted it this time, lifting her chin instead, meeting the eyes of people who, for the first time, truly saw her. The Duke crossed the room and extended a hand, not as a gesture of charity, but of genuine respect between equals. "Ashcombe owes you a debt no ledger can properly record," he said quietly for her alone. "I intend to spend considerably more than one season making certain you know it." She took his hand, and for the first time in 3 long years she did not feel invisible at all. Spring arrived at Ashcombe Hall with a warmth the estate had not felt in years. The northern fields, once threatened with seizure, were tilled and planted again, workers returning to land that had sat fallow through the darkest of the family's winters. The chandeliers in the great hall burned at full brightness now, not from recklessness, but from the quiet confidence of a house no longer counting every candle against its survival. She no longer worked from the shadows of forgotten corners. At the Duke's insistence, she had taken on a role no one in the household had a proper title for, advisor, perhaps, or partner in all but name. Her ledgers now openly consulted, her opinions sought before decisions were made rather than dismissed after the fact. The steward, humbled by his own oversight, had become, unexpectedly, one of her staunchest allies. The Duke found himself seeking her out in ways that had little to do with figures or accounts. Evenings that once passed in solitary silence now often included her quiet company by the fire, conversations that stretched longer than either of them intended, comfortable in a way neither had experienced in years. What had begun as necessity slowly softened into something neither dared name too quickly, though the household staff had already begun to whisper with knowing smiles. She still visited the floorboard beneath her bed sometimes, though it now held nothing but memory, the papers long since transferred to the family's official records, her father's careful handwriting preserved not as a secret, but as a legacy finally allowed to breathe in daylight. Standing once more at her window that overlooked the fields, now green and thriving beneath a sky finally clear of storm clouds, she thought of the 3 years she had spent unseen, and the quiet patience that had carried her through them. She had not asked for gratitude. She had not asked for recognition. But watching Ashcombe Hall come alive again, watching the Duke who had once walked past her without a glance now cross a room simply to sit beside her, she understood that some of the most profound transformations begin not with grand declarations, but with someone, finally, choosing to see. The estate had been saved. But so, in its own quiet way, had she.